Alright, Beyond Good and Evil, a prelude to a philosophy of the future. Aphorism 11. Oh, it's about Kant. You can love that. It's a nice long one. I didn't write it. Okay. It seems to me that today attempts are made everywhere to divert attention from the actual influence Kant exerted on German philosophy, and especially to ignore prudently the value he set upon himself. Kant was first and foremost proud of his table of categories. With that in his hand, he said, "This is the most difficult thing that could ever be undertaken on behalf of metaphysics. Let us only understand this could be." He was proud of having discovered a new faculty in man, the faculty for synthetic judgment a priori. So the could be is, this is the most difficult thing that could ever be undertaken. That's the could be. Suppose he deceived himself in this matter. The development and rapid flourishing of German philosophy depended nevertheless on his pride and on the eager rivalry of the younger generations to discover, if possible, something still prouder, at all events, new faculties. But let us reflect. It is high time to do so. How are synthetic judgments a priori possible, Kant asked himself, and what really is his answer? By virtue of a faculty. But unfortunately not in 5 words, not so circumstantially, venerably, and with such a display of German profundity and curlicues, the people simply failed to note the comical naïveté allemande involved in such an answer. People, let's see, he says with naïveté allemande, that means German foolishness. People were actually beside themselves with delight over this new faculty, and the jubilation reached its climax when Kant further discovered a moral faculty in man, for at that time the Germans were still moral and not yet addicted to realpolitik. The honeymoon of German philosophy arrived. All the young theologians of the Tübingen seminary went into the bushes, all looking for faculties. And what did they not find in that innocent, rich, and still youthful period of the German spirit to which Romanticism, the malignant fairy, piped and sang when one could not yet distinguish between finding and inventing? So that's a lot of interesting stuff there, the distinction between finding and inventing, the notion that Romanticism is a malignant fairy. I find that important. The notion that the Germans became addicted to realpolitik, he thought, by his time, the late 1800s, and that they hadn't always been. And just a characterization of old Kant. Okay, above all, a faculty of the supersensible. Schelling christened it intellectual intuition, and thus gratified the most heartfelt cravings of the Germans, whose cravings were at bottom pious. One could do no greater wrong to the whole of this exuberant, enthusiastic movement, which was really youthfulness, however boldly it disguised itself in hoary and senile concepts, than to take it seriously, or worse, to treat it with moral indignation. Enough. One grew older, and the dream vanished. A time came when people scratched their heads, and they still scratch them today. One had been dreaming, and first and foremost, old Kant. By virtue of a faculty, he had said, or at least meant, but is this an answer, an explanation, or is it not really a repetition of the question? How does opium induce sleep? By virtue of a faculty, something we still don't know. Namely, the virtus dormitiva, replies the doctor in Molière. Que est nihil virtus dormitiva, cujas et naturas sensus assupiere? But such replies belong in comedy, and it is high time to replace the Kantian question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, by another question, why is belief in such judgments necessary? And to comprehend that such judgments must be believed to be true, for the sake of the preservation of creatures like ourselves, though they might, of course, be false judgments for all that. Or to speak more clearly and coarsely, synthetic judgments a priori should not be possible at all. We have no right to them. In our mouths they are nothing but false judgments. Only, of course, the belief in their truth is necessary, as a foreground belief in visual evidence belonging to the perspective optics of life. And I don't think through skepticism they have to be held as true in the traditional sense, and I don't think actually Nietzsche does either. I think he's talking about you have to hold them true in the old sense, which is you reason from them. You start with an assumption that they're true. But since you realize it's an assumption, it's not the same concept of truth that you formerly had. Finally, to call to mind the enormous influence of that German philosophy, I hope you understand its right to quotation marks, German philosophy, has exercised throughout the whole of Europe. There's no doubt that a certain kind of virtus dormitiva had a share in it. It was a delight to the noble idlers, the virtuous, the mystics, artists, three-quarter Christians, and political obscurantists of all nations to find, thanks to German philosophy, an antidote to the still predominant sensualism which overflowed from the last century into this, in short, sensus superiori. So, So the faculty of falling to sleep. It's a bit of a parody on the faculty of falling asleep, and its relation to Kant. And yet again, there's this yin yang of, but it doesn't mean it wasn't good for Germany. Believing that Kant was onto something that he wasn't really onto inspired a reaction that was a youthful growth period. And again, like a lot of youthful growth period, you can go, oh, well, that was nuts. But it has its positive and negatives as well, is what I'm getting at. Cheers. So the important part of this, I think, is this notion. If anybody's seen the BBC interview of Richard Feynman, for example, it's like his father's like, no, we don't know why this or that happens. We know what to call it. We know how it works. We know the mathematical equations, but we don't understand it. And that's what Nietzsche is getting at, is this idea that you can explain a lot of things about something and still simply be saying, well, it has the characteristic that it does this. And ultimately, when you get down to even a well-reduced explanation, these explanations are really a little bit like, there's a faculty. Now, he's also pointing out that Kant in particular, at a high level, relied on that. But the more important thing is that down at bottom, we still have this issue, which is why he's raising the fact that we may have to believe in things that aren't necessarily true, or even that we might know can't be proved true. And he plays with words to talk about them as if they're not true in any sense. But what's really the case is that they're not true in the classical sense, but that by some understanding and a organic ability to form values, a person defines themselves and everything else falls from that.